Horizon Song. Wind howled across the frost-shorn rock of the northern cliffs like death's knell made manifest, a punishing tune which few living things could stomach. The waters in the bay beneath them roiled ice-cold in the gloating shadow of the mountains, volcanic vents far below keeping them just shy of freezing over. Overhead, a thick snow was whipped to and fro by the wind, thick as fog, leaving little more tangible than silhouettes through the howling gale. So hopeless was the misty gray tyranny of the vista that a foreign wanderer would be forgiven for believing they'd stumbled into a mystic dystopia which had never known summer's touch, and would ever languish beneath the barbed lash of the long chill. Kahanka was no foreigner. For Kahanka, the bay meant glory. His reddish reptilian eyes glinted in what frail remnants of sunlight reached them, locked on the deepest part of the bay, transparent eyelids shielding them from the errant snow and saltwater froth. The head of his longboat dipped and soared, its burly rowers heaving it across the bay's chaotic surface, but Kahanka was unperturbed by the cold and the damp. That isn't to say the reptile was immune to it, though, merely hardened to it. The thick pelts that wreathed him shielded heated shale which had been lashed to either side of his torso. A low fire in the covered urn beneath the deck heated many such stones, for the crew's cold-blooded temperatures were always under assault from the press of the North's cruel air. No matter how fresh off the fire each stone might be, no matter how thick the banded furs of a parka might be wound, comfort was an impossibility here. The crew's thick, clawed digits screamed numb beneath their padded gloves, and their crocodilian snouts needled and pulsed with gnawing frost beneath their woolen hide wraps. All that could be hoped for was survival, and the warriors aboard the ship asked for nothing more. Off to the side, more boats rowed onward, neck and neck with Kahanka's labored vessel. Each clan wanted its sons to be in the lead when the hunt began, and each boat vied for the most exalted position. In this race, the most dangerous placing was the one most coveted, and Kahanka had long prepared his brood brothers on the oars for the occasion. They hung in step now, anticipating the first sign of life from below. When the time was right, Kahanka would give his signal, and they would make their move. Until then, they matched pace with their fellow warriors, the cold boring deeper and deeper into the hides and pelts of their clothing, waiting. Thick, languid bubbles burst far off the prow, and Kahanka's voice raked the cool air in a triumphal, wordless roar. The oarsmen surged at his call, all their energy thrust into the unyielding sea, dragging their ship out ahead of the others. The drummer, seated before the fire to the rear, heightened his pace, bringing their cold blood to a boil with his rhythmic thunder. The oarsmen sang a growling chant in time with the drummer's rhythm, exalting Crummock, lord of skies and father of courage, that he might grace them with worthy ends. Over the frothing water they glided, into the path of danger. Danger was where the Ida thrived, it had long been said. Their crocodilian kind, anathema to the warm-blooded kindreds of the world, balked at no challenge and shied from no contest. This was no exception, and had an outlander been present to watch with bated breath the beginning of the hunt, they would have marveled at the steeled gazes and iron-hard grips, betraying nothing of fear or nerves. The Ida had no more tolerance for such things than the stalking tiger or the trampling mastodon. They knew only victory and death. Kahanga slid free his massive two-handed blade, cruelly hooked after the brutal fashion of Ida Smith's. All around him his brood brothers, free of the oars, drew spears and axes, growling along with their leader as he sang, every man among their number anticipating what lurked beneath them. The other boats struggled to keep up, their own warriors bristling with drawn steel, slitted eyes narrowed over the inky depths. The water around the leading longboat erupted, mighty tentacles coming up to either side as the beast beneath latched onto the reinforced hull of the ship. Kahanga, war song rumbling beneath his woolen shroud, danced across the deck, agile as a gallivanting elk despite his size. Massive frame thrashing this way and that, he lopped wriggling arms from the air and sent their bloody ruins tumbling back into the sea. Each lashing strike of the monster's tendrils was met by a sidelong leap over the huddled oarsman, or howling swipe of metal to slice the seeking flesh, the taste of torn squid on the air sending Kahanga into a ravening frenzy. Some of his brothers were not so skilled. Shu'ut, a young hatchling of no more than 20 winters, had his song cut short when he was plucked from the deck and dragged below. His demise was silent, met with the brutal discipline which befit his kind. So too did the several others grasped by the beast go, thrashing to the last but never crying out, letting their brethren know they had died well. A clan on a neighboring longboat, crowding in to thrust long harpoons down into the beast's unseen head from the side, was toppled by the squid as it bobbed and thrashed. Some 18 Ida souls were dumped into the water. All of the warriors were doomed, Kahanga knew, for no amount of heated slate would dry the briny chill from their soaked fur clothing. None made to help, but every boat watched, silently urging the dead men to action. One among their number, Ska'al, eldest son of their clan, fought through the pincering pain of the unyielding cold. His jagged maw grunted and growled words of vengeance, shoring up his final act of courage as he grasped a sturdy spear from amongst the wreckage and paddled for the writhing squid. Ska'al's eyes met Kahanga's for just a moment as he swam, old rivalries forgotten. The dying warrior sung his horizon song. Ska'al's voice gained power, spurred on in its final moments. The song he sung reached the ears of the farthest oarsman, growling its testament to the gnawing wind. It told of the broodmates he'd lost, and of the battles he'd won, of summers past and prey he'd yet to claim. Then, with a final rousing chant, he called Crummock's godly eyes down upon him and dipped beneath the water's surface at the boat's edge. Kahanka's vessel rocked, the remaining arms swayed, and the dark water beneath shone black with ink and blood. Kahanga caught one of the arms, as did some of the oarsmen. With the aid of hooks and nooses of sturdy rope, the practiced hands of the mighty Ida hauled in their monstrous kill. Planted clean through its vile head, rupturing its shield-sized eyes, Ska'al's spear hung. Its honored wielder floated up not long after, too frozen through to do more than sputter and cough in his final minutes. Neither he nor his fellows in the water cried for help. They simply waited for their time, each plucked from the water and set with careful hands upon the boats, spared the torment of rotting on the seafloor, separated from the gleam of Crummock's stormy sky above. His kinfolk on the boats roared their triumph, the name of Ska'al on their lipless mouths. As they wheeled for the distant shallows, Kahanga joined his brood brothers on the oars, sword laid low and reptilian tongue sharp with the salty scent of the mighty corpse on deck. Around the hazy cliffs out of the bay they would wind, some 2 hours rowing along the rocks off the coast. The village of Shungna waited to the south, as it always had, but Kahanga's thoughts were of the sky, of eternity. There was some part of his heart which ached, which lamented that he'd survived the hunt, glorious as it had been. crocodilian head slung high towards Cromuk beyond the metallic clouds overhead. He prayed in hushed growls. The drums were low, measured with the languid pulls of the oars, the rolling thunder of the ocean's surface white noise to the warrior's meditations. Let Kahunga's end be as good as was Skaal's, he thought. The taste of death on the frigid north winds told the boats of Shongna something was very wrong long before they laid eyes on the village proper. Ida physiology was rife with pheromonal triggers, and there was no mistaking the familiar scent of the newly dead, above and beyond the corpses who rode home in glory with them upon the decks. Even so, there was an unfamiliar tang on the deadened winter air, something which tasted acrid even to crocodilian palates partial to rotten meat. Kahunga knew no fear, but he did not wallow blindly into what might have been a trap. Mightiest amongst the boats, lordship fell to him, and it was with some reluctance he ordered the oarsmen to beach the ships on black sands a mile south of Shongna. An expanse of dense snow-capped pines obscured the settlement from here, and much as Kahunga wished to charge in with sword drawn, they knew not what lurked beyond the next curve in the shoreline. They refreshed their heated slate, took up their weapons, and strode into the trees, leaving a guard of 4 sturdy souls for the boats. They did not creep, for their nearly half-ton fur-wrapped bulks of scaly muscle and sinew did not lend themselves to creeping. Even if they could, only the fearful deigned to creep. Kahunga leading with mighty blade in hand, they crunched through the snowy woodland, warmth fast fading from their muscled limbs. Shongna proper was a spiraling set of ringed barrow lodges set back from the coast, the stone interiors and grassy soil roofs obscured under the north's deep winter snowfall. The summer fire pits and amphitheaters were masked beneath the chill, but the powder which carpeted them was tossed and turned, they saw, kicked up by countless foreign feet. A barely visible vapor hung about some of the lodges, lending them a putrid tinge of yellow, and the acidic taste grew almost unbearable. Emerging from the woods, their eyes caught upon a wispy trail of wood smoke amidst the mounds, and they pressed on with hilts gripped tight and teeth gritted for struggle. The struggle, though, had come and gone. Several lodges had been opened up, the thick stone doors having been rolled aside to let the icy light shine into the warm, shadowed depths. A deadly gas which assailed their eyes and brought hacking hisses to their lipless maws seeped from the apertures in thin little streams which were fast lost to the cold winds. Corpses lay here and there, elder warriors and confused hatchlings having stumbled hacking from their dens only to die in the open beneath the gray sky, their black blood seeping from jagged mouths. The village's mastodon herd, who roamed the white fields beyond the lodges, had been riddled with lead and left to collect snow like woolen boulders on the plain. Warriors from among the hunting party drifted off here and there in little bands as they came upon the lodges of their clans, falling to their knees beside the dead in silent, stony respect. Kahunga led on, inward through the rings of the village, towards the central barrow, the mound of his own clan. It was only when they passed into the central circle that they realized what had befallen Shongna. The snow here was painted red. Corpses littered the open ground, rent and torn like dolls. But these were no sons of the Ida. These were little, fragile things, 6 or so feet tall and canine, slate-gray and uniformed in the dark trappings of southern civilization. Their bolt-action rifles and winter gear lay alongside them, dropped in the struggle amidst 100 and more booted footprints. Their hairless skin was rapidly taking on the pallor of death, their irony stink just beginning to tempt the gathering Ida. Kahunga had heard of them before, these warm-blooded southerners, in legends and songs and sagas. Long had they lurked at the edge of Ida consciousness, brooding in their vast, stolen cities beyond the distant southern ranges for millennia. Few Ida less than a century old had ever laid eyes upon them. Murmurs went up amongst the warriors, their raspy exhalations and guttural mutterings excited as they urged Crummock to take heed, told him that sons of his rival were abroad in the Ida lands. Sholashaishans, the great enemy. At the center of the throng of stunted warmbloods, 2 Ida waited at the base of a hastily erected bonfire at the mouth of Kahunka's clan mound. The clan shaman Saak's wizened, lean form was unmistakable. Outlined by the flame, his gaunt claws danced wild gesticulations as he chanted rumbling prayers to the open sky. At his fur-wrapped feet, half stripped despite the winter freeze, a massive form lay prone and bleeding, gasping its final rattling breaths. The fallen one's build, massive even amongst the Ida, made him unmistakable, but it was his scent which told Kahunka all he needed to know. This was the clan chieftain Ku'un, warlord of Shungna, his father. Kahunka sprinted the final distance, falling to his knees before the fire. Several of his brood brothers followed, keeping their distance, allowing the first among the clan sons his place at their father's side. Ku'un was milky white and red-eyed, an albinism which he'd passed to all his offspring. He was ancient by the standards of Ida, nearing his 3rd century of life, older indeed than any in the village save Saak, who chanted above him. He bore the scars of 24 wars and hundreds of raiding seasons, and his brutal wisdom had known no bounds. Those glaring red eyes, so imperious in Kahunka's memory, were now glossy and distant, raking the clouded heavens without a hint of recognition. Countless bullets had riddled his pale hide, and he was streaked with dark blood which coursed at each dying beat of his straining hearts. Even the mighty physiology of this giant among giants could not withstand the punishment he'd been dealt by cruel Sholashaishan gas and lead. Kahunka found it difficult to believe. He looked up to Saak, hearing the old man's growls halt, and the elder tried to reassure him.
"It was a song-worthy death,"
the shaman said.
"The great enemy poured vaporous doom into the dens, and even under the influence of that creeping death, the ancient Ku'un came forth roaring, hammer in hand. He struck down swathes of the southerners, scattered and unprepared for resistance. I stumbled forth from amidst the dead and dying females of the brood, vomiting, gasping, just in time to hear the chieftain's horizon song."
Kahunka could feel the regret in each growled syllable. As a member of people forged in struggle, the shaman was doomed to damnation, sworn to pacifism amidst a nation whose eternity was gained by violent death beneath an open sky. It was a selfless position, revered by all, a testament to the holy man's devotion to helping his brood in the present. Still, the rage scent the shaman gave off let Kahunka taste his fury, let him know that every fiber of the old man's being had yearned to thrash and die with the others. It was not to be, and the great enemy had left the shaman to his torment, a warrior sworn off war, languishing until nothingness took him. The clan waited in silence until their patriarch's strained hisses had ceased. They placed Ku'un's hammer on his chest and, together, hoisted him onto the makeshift pyre, that he might rise to the sky to scourge the horizons with Crummock. The whole clan bellowed, a deep, glottal noise that jolted mammalian eardrums, letting the Lord of Skies know that one of his foremost sons was coming home. As the long winter night fell, other fires crept up around Shungna. Warriors built up snowbanks so the winds could be kept at bay, and they could finally warm themselves in the glow. They mostly kept clear of the mounds, not trusting the putrid air, leaving them as barrows for their damned kin, who had been cheated of a sky-seen death in the dark halls of their own homes. Every female in the village had been slain, and there were no children left at all. The clans of Shung-Na had been shattered. Only Cromak above knew how many other villages had shared their fate, or how broad the Sholushaishan incursion was. Runners had been sent into the dusk to ensure the enemy was long gone, but knowing the warmbloods were leaving did little to quell the vengeful hatred in their chests. Kahanga stewed with his thoughts, silent, away from his brethren. Ida did not feel loss in the chaotic, hysteric way the emotional mammalian kindreds felt it. Rather, it felt to Kahanga as if the light of the sun and stars had fallen away to blackness, and nothing remained to guide his step. He felt aimless, purposeless, adrift. He stared into the depths of his own fire, feeling frozen in spite of the flame. It was then that Sa'ak came to him, lowering his voice, his arrival jerking Kahanga from his waking stupor.
Ka'un's horizon song was no simple recitation of deeds and kindred,
Sa'ak told him, his growling tone one of mingled awe and, almost impossibly, fear, a thing Kahanga tasted on the cold air rather than heard.
It was one of vengeance. Of his many sons, the dying chieftain called your name. Kahanga must annihilate those who have poisoned Shung-Na.
Sa'ak produced a talisman from amidst his bundled furs, a scrimshaw rendition of the winged serpent Cromak. He handed it off to Kahanga, his gloved hand clenching the honored token tight to his chest, his pinkish eyes wide as the shaman whispered behind him.
You are to seek out the Shung-Na dolmen in the western hills. Enter the tombs. Offer flesh to they who wait within. The wretched will carry out your father's will.
Sa'ak rose, seeming sickened by the words he'd spoken, and retreated to the light of the larger fires, taking refuge in the company of others. Kahanga was left to shudder alone, a sensation which had nothing to do with the winter night's torturous temperature. He looked off over the snowy woodland, traced the black outline of the hills on the gray horizon, and gripped tight the hilt of his sword. Dawn came slowly in the Ida lands. Even in the late winter, as the sun began to claw its way back from the long dark, the nights were sluggish and brutal. Warmed by fire and by stone, the Ida of Shung-Na did not rest through the painful freeze. Rather, they prepared. Weapons were fetched from gaseous mounds, great blades and hammers and spears. The crude but effective jezails the northerners favored when hunting at range were brought, the dishonor of long-distance engagements tossed aside in the face of an incursion by the great enemy. The monstrous squid was butchered, wrapped in leathers to be divided on the long march which was to come. Plans were laid, and routes mapped out in the hard-packed snow. Sa'ak summoned up all his centuries of wisdom to pick out a route which would mask them amongst thickets and frigid vales. With their mastodons slain, the warriors would have to move on foot, always a devastating proposition in the cold season. They would rouse solitary burrows and mounds of Ida here and there on the march, warming themselves at the hearths of those who had managed to avoid the great enemy's notice. Much as it grated most of the icy stares in the reptilian throng, their vengeful pursuit of the canines would have to be delayed, put off until they could determine how widespread this incursion had been.
We must awaken the other tribes and call for a moot,
Sa'ak had told them.
Let us gather the full weight of Cromak's sons behind us before we strike out at the foe.
But while the Shungna throng trudged off into the frigid wastes en masse beneath the rising sun, Kahanga forked off from their number in silence. Wandering across snow-choked glens and through ice-strewn forests, he kept his eyes skyward, letting miles melt away as he dwelt on the task before him. It would take all of his will, all of his smoldering fury to brave what lay ahead. Low-slung mountains wreathed in spiny trees rose up from the snowscape, and Kahanga navigated them with the practiced ease of a born hunter. He removed thick gloves to scale rock faces with the iron-strong clawed grip for which the Ida were renowned, shimmying across apertures and sliding down inclines with a grace that contradicted his titanic bulk. A mighty Ta'ani, the elephantine white-maned bears which roamed the heights, had left tree-trunk-sized tracks in the crook of two peaks which Kahanka's eyes effortlessly detected, sending him winding around the long way so that he might avoid a tangle with the ursine kings of the mountains. He'd slung his father's ivory-plated Jezzail over his shoulder in case he came across the outlanders, but the massive scrap gun did little to assure him of victory in the face of a bear which outweighed a grown Ida by more than a ton. Though a struggle against so titanic a foe would have made his heart soar on other occasions, he had to keep focused on the goal, to err on the side of cowardly discretion rather than song-worthy brawn. For now, at least. Kahanga ended the scant hours sunlight lent him at the door of a lodge carved into the mountainside, one he remembered from treks through these passes at his father's side. Several sagely blacksmiths lived there, and he was pleased to find them well and unmolested by whatever warm-blood lurkers were abroad. Though they eyed him warily and kept him at arm's length, tradition dictated they give him warmth for the night, and they let him slip in past the rolling stone door to the sheltered innards of the range. Ida Smiths, priestly hermits who spent lifetimes in seclusion honing their craft and pulling ore from the depths, closely guarded their methods. The three old reptiles made Kahanga wait in the entrance for nearly an hour as they squirreled away tools and works in progress. Finally, they led him into the low-ceilinged residence hall, where their sleeping alcoves waited. As with most Ida dwellings, the warm springs of the far north had been tapped into a carven pool at the center, which steamed faintly with a heat that brightened Kahanga's tired eyes. They soaked, Kahanga resting his worn limbs as they shared the raw squid he'd brought. While it wasn't yet decayed enough to delight the Ida palate, the Highland Smiths were pleased, having gone many decades since tasting the fruits of the sea. They knew the name of Sa'ak, who had once trained with them to uncover Cromac's sacred metalworking, as did all Ida holy men. Only when the conversation had thawed to the friendly swapping of songs did Kahanga tell them of Shungna's dark fate. The Smiths retired to the secluded forge below after the meal, meaning to discuss their plans beyond prying eyes. When they returned, they carried with them masterfully crafted swords, hammers, and Jezzails, wrapped in bundled hides for travel.
"We will move to join the throngs come morning,"
the eldest of them explained.
"The moot will need fresh steel if they are to fight. Can you lead us to them?"
It was only then that Kahanga made his intentions known. He gave them all the instruction they would need to pick up the taste of the Shungna clans on the winds, but he was bound to the fulfillment of the Horizon Song. Hearing this, the eldest smith took up a crude workman's knife and bade the young warrior to lay down on the cool stone. He carved through the pale scales of Kahanga's chest, describing in black blood a horned rune. Though only Ida devoted to Cromac could read the runes, the jagged symbol boiled Kahanga's blood, imparting an aggression he didn't need literacy to decipher. The smith tapped the rune with a gnarled claw, taking up Kahunka's gaze and rasping,
"Executioner."
His dreams were a jolting cavalcade of memories and imagined monsters that night, for safe as he felt in the lodge's warm shadow, he couldn't forget what awaited him beyond sunrise. He remembered his father overseeing his first bone-splintering bout amongst his brood, and the doddering ramblings of the clan's great mother, who had languished demented and rambling in the bowels of Shung-Na a full 3 decades before Crummock finally took her. He remembered slain friends and felt keen the void of the dishonored family who lay strangled in the mounds back home. All this and more would haunt him in the dolmen, and though it made for a poor night's rest, Kahunka was certain his subconscious was racing to prepare him for what was to come. Kahunka slipped from the dwelling before first light, letting the rising sun warm him just as the brutal night had begun to eat into his core. The day passed quickly, as had the first, but the warrior of Shung-Na paid the time no heed, focused entirely on his paces, counting each crunched stride across the snows. He could make the dolmen by nightfall, but only just. When he crested the last craggy rock face beneath a vicious dusk wind, it might as well have been dark beyond the ridge. Before him, in a dip between the mountains, a veil of dense pines sulked beneath a heavy snow shroud, beneath which a thick darkness devoured the sun's aging rays. This, he knew, was the place. With a final look into the dimming heavens above, he walked forth into the trees, and out of Crummock's sight. The sounds of the wood were magnified beneath the frost-strained boughs, each crunch of feet across the glittering floor or snap of branches in the sunset shade careening out beneath the trees like gunfire. Kahunka kept his head level, scanning the rows without letting himself become jittery. Anticipation was high, but he was no hatchling, and he would not let himself be frightened by a dark atmosphere. Not before entering the dolmen. The sight of the mighty stone construct jutting up from amidst the bunched trunks almost broke that steely resolve. Its jagged, ancient sides were half hidden beneath the winter's drifts, and the sapling-eaten roof looked for all the world like a forest of skeletal arms bursting forth from the snow. It was tall and broad, much larger than any traditional Ida longhouse or mound, and the runic carvings upon its angular capstone were morbid even to the illiterate observer. Amidst the marks was the Shung-Na seal, a binding compact of the local clans, one lonely familiar sight adrift amidst cold, alien boulders. The circular stone door below was dark against the pallor of the winter, watching the newcomer like an unblinking eye, seeming to dare him to make his move. It was then that Kahunka's nerve-heightened senses alerted him to something amiss in the thicket, bringing his hand slowly, almost cautiously, to the hilt of his greatsword where it rested on his back. He held his breath, mighty crocodilian lungs millennia removed from the water still clinging to oxygen as if they expected to drown on the frigid tree-muffled wind. His reddish eyes narrowed, the slits swelling, straining to pick out the danger. His toothy maw yawned, his broad tongue sweeping the air, his mind prickling as he realized he knew the scent. Yeti. A force like a falling pine tree slammed Kahunka's shoulder, sending him stumbling off into the nettles and drifts beside the dolmen. He regained his balance with ease, shaking off the bruising blow, shrugging free his hooked blade with practiced ease as he wheeled to face the foe. Having dropped from the trees, it crouched low, scanning him with beady yellow eyes in the dying light. It was apish, elongated, taller than an Ida but wiry like a starving exile. Its hands were brutish, gray against the sickly white of its fur. Its mouth opened in a spiny growl that made even the Ida's fury seem tame, the first noise it had made in its deadly approach. It braced for a lunge, eyes narrowed, the blunt brain behind red with anger at this intrusion into its isolated thicket. Kahanga grinned. The twisted thing lurched with an agility which would have broken lesser fighters, meaning to crush the interloper in a deadening grapple. Kahanga leapt forward past the groping ape, a heavy stroke of his sword hewing the thing's left arm from its shoulder mid-air and tinting the forest with the irony warmth of blood. It roared its protest as it crashed into the snow, wriggling a stump which could no longer respond as it registered what had happened. Before it could rise to its full height, Kahanga planted his blade in its skull with a downward thrust that would test stone, drawing a final, pitiful stammer from its smacking jowls before it sank to the ground in a cloud of blood-wrought steam. The Ida kicked the thing free with one fur-wrapped foot, allowing himself a moment's relaxation as he meticulously wiped clean his blade. Though he had allowed the thing to slip up on him amidst all the worry over the dolmen, he'd been almost happy to scent it. What was some half-intelligent animal next to the things which waited beneath the stone? A welcome distraction, he thought to himself, picking up the severed limb and drinking deep of the red gouts which had yet to run dry, savoring every sensation. Letting the heat of the warm blood's fluids fight back a bit of the night's coming cold, Kahanga forced his gaze back to the door of the dolmen once more. He had to make himself roll it aside, hesitating at the brink. Muttering a curse at his own timidity, he ducked in through the low entryway, his reptilian sight adjusting after the low glare of the frozen outdoors. The dolmen was a massive chamber of rune-etched stone, with a ceiling that made one stoop, at least if the one in question stood more than 10 feet tall. The floor fast fell away into a radial pattern of descending steps towards a circular platform in the center. The strangled light from the entrance poured around Kahanga and down those steps, landing on the figure which poised cross-legged in the center of that barren stretch of stone. It was an Ida, or had once been. It was mummified, emaciated and wrapped in millennia-old strips of leather. Odd protrusions and extra limbs sprouted from its torso, and its dusty fingers seemed more scythes than claws. Deformed and ancient as it was, there was no frailty in the staring corpse. Dead weight filled the air of the dolmen, making each strained tread of Kahanga's massive feet along the stone feel portentous. The whole floor of the mock crypt was covered in such monstrosities, all deformed in varied but equally hideous ways. There were more than 50 of them, flanking the walls and seated upon the stairs, all sockets turned downward toward the central figure. Kahanga kept his head locked on that first form as he moved, growing closer and closer. An outsider might have marveled at the nervous tension in his stride. They might, if far removed from earshot of an Ida, have accused the warrior of fear. Kahanga had reason to believe as if he were being watched, however. He was being watched. Only once he was on the bottom platform with the seated figure did he bow low and set aside his sword and jezail, holding up his palms in deference to show he came in submission. It was not a familiar feeling for him. He sat down before the corpse with twitching, jittery limbs, every part of him screaming for a retreat he was sworn not to make. Kahanga removed his thick glove, setting it upon his lap, before holding his palm up before the empty sockets of the millennia-dead Ida. Eyes narrowed, he drove his teeth into the scaled flesh, drawing up streams of the cooling black blood which flowed beneath. Then, a final jolt of hesitation. Was he certain? Could he withstand what was to come? He lifted his palm up to the dried snout of the corpse, as if proffering a flower for another to smell. For a moment, there was no change. Then, all at once, it began. Tenebrous, ominous creaking sounded as the limb of the corpse rose. Its clawed digits locked around the warrior's fur-wrapped arm, holding the hand in place. The scything talons cut garment and drew yet more blood as they bit lightly into flesh. The cracking of ancient joints brought the snout down to the offering. Its maw opened, its teeth unnaturally sharp in spite of the passage of time. Every twitch of its tissue-thin flesh followed close by Kahanka's eyes. The jaws closed, the head twisted, and the hand disappeared. Kahanga took the wound with all the stoicism expected of him, barely blinking as the thing snapped bones and chewed gristle, devouring the hand in pursuit of a hunger it shouldn't have. He didn't protest, didn't squirm at the taste of his own fluid on the dolmen's tepid air. The worst was yet to come. Its sightless yet all-seeing sockets rose. He felt its whispers rather than heard them, saw its speechless maw twist and flap and spill his fresh blood as images filled his mind. They were like memory, summoned up from distant hatchling summers, save these were no memories of his own. Still, they were tactile to him, more tangible than even the present world around him. In that moment, he was on the rocky desert cliffs overlooking an arid valley, far to the south. In it, domes of sandstone and statues of bronze rang with the clang of metalwork and the hissing tenacity of the Ida tongue. Kahanga felt the warmth of a sun which knew no winters on his bare scales, tasted the smoke of the forges on the still air. Paradise. Though he had never seen it, he knew in his bones that this was the cradle, the city from which all Ida had once surged, observed as it would have been more than 4,000 years ago, before the long exile, before the great enemy. He saw that enemy break its bonds beneath the earth, where they had been kept by their Ida masters to work the mines. He saw them take up the arms that had been forbidden them, saw them organize and plot and scheme in ways only the Sholashaishans could. He saw their one-eyed warlord rally them, lead them onto the surface, revel in the burning and the bleeding and the upheaval. He saw the cowardice-cursed Ida of that great cradle flee, streaming out of the valley up the canyons, outnumbered and outwitted by a foe they'd dismissed since time immemorial. So it was that the cradle fell into the hands of the canines, and became in time the heart of their own vast empire. Centuries slipped past in the grips of that deathly stare. He saw the cradle's clans repulsed by the other Ida holds, rebuffed by familial rivalries and petty differences. He saw each hold fall, one by one, warlord by warlord, all ground to dust beneath the coordination and cunning of the tiny, warm-blooded foe. By the time the Ida holds banded together, the homeland was long past salvation. Clan after bloodied clan slunk north through the mountains, leaving the deserts behind. First, they hid in the highlands. Then, they hid in the trees. Only when the winters grew harsh and the soil grew worthless did the mammal kindreds halt their march and leave the far north to their hated foe, to languish, stranded, in a land which was not their own, whose very air sapped the vitality from their cold blood and broke the backs of that proud warrior people under privation and stagnation and want. Kahanga looked deep into the sockets that held him. He understood the humiliation in a way the songs of shamans and traveling bards could never relay. He understood a fear and revulsion he had never before felt. He was reminded of a homeland he had never known. In that moment, the heroic battles and noble defeats were lost to him, as was the continued vitality of his exiled people, drowned amidst the shame and sorrow of the old souls before him. These were the Shungna band's progenitors, these defaced sculptures of flesh and sinew. These were among the Ida masters who fell in the cradle beneath the great enemy's blades. They had been twisted by the rituals of Harakwe, Sholashahidi's subterranean war god, the heart of the earth. Their priesthood had sacrificed thousands, carved out hearts to bend the very fabric of reality and tie it to these despised emblems of their long bondage, an eternal insult to those who had held them for so long beneath the ground. Like the kingly mummies of the Shaishans themselves had these wraiths been prepared. Unlike the honored dead of the canines, though, when these wraiths dwelt out of sight of the sky, they were beyond the gaze of their sky serpent, Cromach. In the years of struggle in that storied age of myth, some had been stolen back by raid and subterfuge, dragged off to be burned and rejoin their kin in the great above. They would not burn, though, nor would they rot. And so, with the half-living revenants agonized by the sun which they had once so revered, they had to be buried away. His mind was weighted with countless centuries of darkness, each minute spent in the silent tomb coming home to roost in his skull like parasites. He heard the mocking calls of the great enemy's glaring god, a rolling presence like thunder beneath the rock and stone. He heard the seeking calls of the winged serpent above, but could not call out to Cromach through the shadow and soil. Kahanga wept. One of the twisted corpse's several limbs rose, a sharp claw bringing the warrior's face back up to meet its own, forcing him to take heed of its roiling black gaze. It demanded he answer in tones which were not tones, whispers which were not whispers. Who? Kahanga thought of Shung-Na, of that foul stench, of the corpse of his father. He had not seen the foe depart. Somehow, though, he knew the wretch had learned what it needed to know. It proffered a triangular plate of metal from its own desiccated lap, holding it out to the maimed warrior with the tenderness of a mother. It was about the size of an Ida chest, curved so that it fit the torso perfectly. From each point, a nearly foot-long blade of aged southern iron glinted in the light of the dolmen, a relic of the cradle, he knew. Kahanga exhaled, readying himself, lifting the tool into place with his remaining hand, the tip of each blade resting above each of his 3 rhythmically beating hearts. We cannot help you escape to the sky once the deed is done. The thought was cold, as had been all the thoughts of this twisted tomb. There was hope buried beneath it, though. Cruel as the ages had been to the wretched, the years had not stripped all emotion from the husk seated before him.
I know.
With those words, Kahanga plunged the blades into his chest, feeling ice grip him as the metal pierced its targets. He tumbled to the stone, relic still buried in his flesh, black blood soaking his parka. A howl rose up among the wretched, more fierce than a winter storm across the northern sea. They skittered like beetles, pouring over each other on bent and misshapen limbs, flooding out of the tiny aperture in the dolmen and onto the snows of the Idalands in search of their prey, far too fast to be creatures of this realm. Kahanga could not revel in the awesome significance of the sight. Vision hazy, he clawed his way to the edge of the platform, sliding up the stairs one painful lunge at a time. Every moment that passed drew more numb clumsiness into his arms, and as the seconds ticked over into minutes, even the mighty physiology of the Ida seemed doomed to fail before he reached the doorway. He thought to his father, lungs ruined and body filled with southern lead, hacking the legions of the enemy in his dying minutes. Humming rather than singing, he rolled himself over the edge of the stairs and dragged himself on quaking claws over the lip of the dolmen into the cruel, biting snow. Kamashkoat's bat-like ears perked up again in the eternal northern wind, flexing against the wool of the cap he wore. Even beneath the muffling winter wear, his sensitive ears could catch the wailing howls from the wind, like the murderous cackling of coyote back home, only worse. Here, in the alien Idalands, no sound was welcome. "That's it again," Meshtak murmured beside him, the words almost lost in the muffling folds of his scarf. "Closer as well," Kamashkoat confirmed, his ice-blue eyes fumbling their way across the dark pines which ate up the horizon. There was a moment's hesitation, both of them looking from the distant source of the horrid sound to their slumbering camp, set low along the edge of a great frozen lake. "Should we try and budge the head inquisitor?" "He'll just chew us out," Kamashkoat said, more than a little reluctant. "We leave at dawn. We'll be clear of the ground in an hour or two." He threw a glance out to the 10 bulky triplanes which rested on the ice, as if to reassure himself that escape were possible. Though they had only been in this Harakwe-blasted wasteland for 2 weeks, he already felt as if years had been etched out of his life by the chill. It didn't help that more than a few of the villages they'd been sent to cull had put up resistance. While it wasn't Kamashkoat's place to question the will of the Tlatoani, this cloak-and-dagger mission beyond the northern ranges should have been the purview of the legions, not the priesthood. Whatever the Empire's aims were with the slumbering Ida, he couldn't wait to be free of this hellscape and back on the road to civilization. Another roar sounded, this one closer. It was different, though, echoing out from the south, across the ice. For a moment, he and his companion on the watch stayed silent, their eyes prying the shadows across the lake. When the second howl came from the north, opposite the first, they both made for the tents. Several other pairs were doing the same. One, an inquisitor from Kushkotlan, ducked into each tent he passed along the way, shouting to those inside as he went. Had he seen something? Kamashkoat was about to ask Meshtak as much when the distant flash of motion caught his eye on the lake, out past the expedition's plains. With the stars and aurora bright in the northern sky, he could pick out figures against the white field, low-slung and scrabbling by grotesque leaps and bounds across the ice. Wolves? Bears? Yeti? Too many. 15 or 20 there were, and they moved fast, impossibly fast, eating up space like an automobile. Gripping tight to his rifle, he turned back toward camp just in time to hear the first screams rise up from amidst the tents. A skeletal shadow, giant and clawed, tore through a wall of canvas on the farther side of camp. It held a squirming victim in its crocodilian jaws, but it was no northern savage, not of any sort he'd ever seen. Writhing scythes that served as fingers jabbed and ripped, spilling entrails and flesh across the snow. An overturned lantern set the tent from which it emerged ablaze in a rush of heated air, backlighting the gruesome creature, silhouetting its 4 lopsided arms as they maimed its butchered quarry. The camp was alive then. More of the things burst up from the snow like leaping cats or slid out from behind trees with a preternatural, disgusting coordination, plucking awakened priests from their feet and dragging them to the slaughter. Fires spread across the camp, and scattered rifle and machine gun fire clattered out across the wastes. None of the beasts were perturbed, and as Kamashkoat began to count the wretched things, he realized their diminished company was doomed. He was about to say something to Meshtak, to suggest a sprint for the plains, anything to make good on this hopeless charnel house. A figure drove past from behind as he inhaled, missing him by inches, bowling Meshtak off his boots and into the drifts as it went. The foam of blood and shorn flesh that followed coated Kamashkoat's face, doused him with sudden, awful warmth. Kamashkoat backpedaled, unloading his rifle into the juddering, many-limbed corpse thing which ravaged his companion, his fingers shuddering through his glove upon the bolt. The rounds didn't even give it pause. He tossed aside the weapon, sprinting with all his might, careening out onto the ice. He couldn't even fly, didn't know the first thing about triplanes. He wasn't thinking, though, just panicking, his mind flitting through courses of action which all ended in failure. He didn't get far. So far gone was Kahanga that he didn't feel the cold or the wet. He kicked outward, rolling onto his back next to the slain Yeti. His shuddering rasp of relief was complemented by a small gap in the pine nettles overhead, a starry expanse of the night sky peeping in from beyond. In it, the emerald aurora of Crummock danced its winding dance, painting the void with dazzling life. Kahanga could hear the distant howls of his long-dead kin as they ate up the miles in loping, horrible strides, could feel the frothing gore slicken his body as he croaked out the final words of his song. It was, he decided, a good end. One final time, eyes skyward, Kahanga grinned.